Hello. Today we'll be reading 2 chapters because one of them is relatively short. Chapter 7. Something about the penalties of lordship, together with Chanticleer's prayer. At 12 noon on the following day, Chanticleer the rooster was to be found plotched upon a mud heap in the middle of a wet and runny field, in the middle of a gray and rainy day. Spasmodically, his wings slapped the mud around him, and his head jerked with the little bark of the word "ha." His color was spoiled yellow in the rain, and everywhere his feathers stuck to his body. It is a lesson how one may pass quickly from the immortal feeling of triumph to the mortal mood of grumpiness. From midnight to noon, Chanticleer had made the transition. He was in a filthy mood. But then he had a multitude of reasons, any one of them good enough to provoke the dun cow herself. There was, first of all, the rain. The night had passed, the rat had disappeared, but the rain had not. Tap, tap, tap. Through the night and through the morning after it, the chilly drizzle had persisted, and the boding clouds hung very near the earth. There was no sun, that sickly day, no cleanliness to crow to, only a leaden light, which made breathing difficult, which sucked the green out of the leaves, and which made the muddy field feel like a hopeless hallway. Nothing whatever was solid in such a rain. The earth was slippery, water dribbled everywhere, the sky merely dripped, and every standing thing lay down to weep. Plot, plottery, plot, plot. The rain fell into the puddles all around him, spinning out foolish circles. Nonsense. Ha! And nonsense. Chanticleer hated the drear rain, and he would have attacked a puddle if it would have done any good. But it wouldn't have, and so he was grumpy. His soul itself was damp. "Ha!" he said bitterly, blinking to keep the water out of his eyes and slapping the mud. "Ha! Cock-a-bull whistle! Ha!" Also, he had the throbbing pain of the wound in his stomach. In fact, the wound was the reason why he should be squatting in the mud at all. When he had awakened that morning, he had heard the rain on the roof, and had decided without a second thought that he'd stay inside, where dry was dry, even if it was also dim for seeing. He would crow lauds, the first crow of the day, from right where he was on his sleeping perch, and then go back to sleep. If that meant that the hen's ears would ring on account of a nearby crow, and if that meant that Mundocani would feel rejected since his mat of a back had not been used for the crow, well, so be it. Chanticleer had earned the right to crow from his perch. But what no one had told him, and what he himself had absolutely forgotten, was that his wound had stiffened during the night, and glued itself to his roost. The scab included the wood he was perched upon. So when he stood up to crow, he only gargled and tumbled from the perch. The scab had ripped open. The wound had begun to bleed afresh. The pain had shot backward all the way to his gizzard, and the rooster was furious with himself for so foolish an action. Then one other damnable thing happened, and he went outside into the rain, grumbling blackly to himself, and looking around for some sticky mud. Dripping mud would be useless. Thick, sticky mud was what he wanted. This he found in the middle of an open field. He pushed up a pile of the stuff with his claws, kicking it out behind him and patting it smooth. Then he straddled the pile and settled down upon it as if it had been a nest of eggs to be hatched. It was his poultice. "Mud, be nice to that cut," he said. "Mud, be a friend to me." And then he sat all alone, with rivulets passing him by on every side, and looked at nothing. "Hens," he said. "God can cork, skewer, pluck, gut, and boil them for all I care. Hens!" For the hens of his coop had done that other damnable thing to send him out of his coop. They were the ultimate, indisputable cause of his grumpiness. Neither the rain nor his wound could match them for botheration. What the hens had done was to try to comfort him. They had quick feeling eyes for somebody's pain, and they had seen the blood run down his azure legs to the white toenails beneath. If their ears were ringing after that morning gargle, to be truthful, they didn't show it. Instead, all 30 of them gathered around the bleeding rooster, clucking busy bouquets of sympathy and dipping their pretty white heads. They offered him water for his hurt, water for his forehead and his thirst. They peeped at his wound, shuddered, and kissed him fondly on his wattles. They draped their wings over him for the warmth, and they cuddled him. Now, even that would have been all right. Chanticleer could enjoy the cuddle of a pert and pretty hen on a rainy day. In fact, that might be the quickest way to perk a rooster up, ripen his comb to a violet red, and heal his wound. But, cock-ha-ha! The prettiest and the pertest hen, the plumpest and proudest scoot of a hen, was nothing more than a chicken if she had to say "sir" in the middle of a cuddle. "Lord God!" Chanticleer cried out from the middle of a wide and soggy field, from the top of a mud pile, through the moist air, to the belly of the clouds, gray from horizon to horizon. "I put it to you, who put me over this coop. What good is a kiss if it comes with a 'please you, sir'? That is a chilly kiss. And what kind of a love is it that curtsies? And where is companionship and fear?" Chanticleer began to beat the mud on either side of him and to spit as if there were bile in his mouth. "I didn't ask for this," he shouted. "You, God, you bound me body and soul to it, and you never told me. Come down out of heaven and tell me why. I can be only one thing around these hens, a leader, a commander, and ever right and never wrong. Do you suppose that I could put my head down and weep like that boat-headed dog you sent me? Of course not. Oh, you know that very well. The hens would panic and their world collapse. Do you suppose I could be afraid out loud? Even you don't suffer this loneliness. You who are never afraid. Do you suppose I could make love to a 'yes, sir'? Do you think I could hold a 'good of you, sir' close to myself and call it love? Of course not. Of course not. Oh, you know that almighty well indeed. I should line my roost with pots and pans and be as happy. Pots and pans can only clang, but all this sweet propriety of my mincing hens is nothing more than the clang of a chicken. Let the Lord God," Chanticleer roared to the heavens, "let the Lord God himself come down and stand before me and give an accounting of himself, that he makes roosters lonely." "Ah, forget it," he grumped, suddenly tired of his prayer. "Go step on a mountain somewhere." The rooster slurped down deeper into his mud pile. His feathers were steaming gently, and his little eye cocked balefully at a slippery world. "This, that, and the other," he mumbled to himself for no reason at all. "This, that, and the other. This, that, and the other. Ha!" Then he became aware of a little figure with him in the wide world. "Blow it out your nose," he said to a mouse creeping through the field. But she only looked at him and didn't try to blow anything out of anywhere. Chapter 8. The wee widow mouse makes herself known, as far as she is able, and after that Chanticleer finds a treasure. Chanticleer looked away from the mouse and expected her to wander on to wherever she was going. She didn't. She stood still and looked at him. Chanticleer peered off at the iron-gray sky for a while. Then he poked around at the edges of his mud pile and slithered his backside around in order to make a better seat. When this was done, he glanced over at the mouse, then quickly glanced away. She was still there, gazing at him, gazing directly into his eyes. Chanticleer whistled a tune out of the side of his beak. It was beginning to dawn on him that he was uncomfortable under this woman's gaze. In fact, it was downright embarrassing to be squatting on a heap of mud in the smack middle of a wide and empty field in the middle of the rain, and to have this small, watchful audience while he did. Chanticleer got up, turned a half-circle so that his tail was aimed at the mouse, and plotched himself down again. He counted up to 157. She was gone now. She went home. Good. But he hadn't heard her go away. But of course she was gone. Who would stand around in the rain for no other reason than to stare at a rooster? She had crept away, too polite to say anything to a royal bird, and that's why he hadn't heard her leave. But it didn't feel as if she were gone away. In fact, Chanticleer snapped his head around so that he was looking straight over his back. She was still there, gazing at him. "Did you hear what I said?" said the rooster over his back. The mouse nodded. A drop of rain slipped off the end of her nose. "Well?" She didn't do anything. She looked at him. "You know what it means?" She shook her head. "It means go home. Blow it out your nose means go home very, very fast. Move, begone, I don't want you here." The mouse kept standing where she was and looking at him. "Cockatrice!" The rooster started to crow, but the crow got stuck in his neck because his head was twisted all the way around. "So then, fine then," he said as he stood up. He made a great show of standing up. "Take this place, and I'll go find another. Perhaps you'd like a warm mud puddle." Chanticleer began to strut away, muttering. When he glanced back, he saw that she was still looking at him, only she had bent her head sideways in order to still see him. That did it. He ran at her, flapping his wings and spraying water out in 2 wonderful arcs. "Blow it out your nose!" he shouted, and the mouse began to cry. Suddenly, "blow it out your nose" sounded like a dismally stupid thing to say, especially since they were the only 2 creatures in all this wet field, and since rain makes creatures need one another. The mouse was crying with wide-open eyes. The rooster sat down again upon his mud pile, this time facing her, and this time he waited for her to talk. But he didn't look her in the eyes because she had never once taken her eyes off him, and he was ashamed. Her tears flowed sadly through water already on her face. When she was done crying, she said quietly, "My children," and then she stopped. Chanticleer didn't interrupt even her silence now. He waited. She was so much soaked that at a distance she had seemed to him another piece of mud dropped on the field. She was remarkably thin, since her fur was pasted to her sides, and little and tired, her bones so small they should have melted in all this rain. "My children are in the river," she said. "The river?" Chanticleer breathed. "You came all the way from the river?" The river was several miles south. She nodded. "My husband is dead," she said quietly. "But your children, they are alive." She nodded, still looking at him. It was the same look which she had all along, but now for the first time Chanticleer could see that it was asking many questions. "But, widow, you said they were in the river," Chanticleer said, himself speaking quietly now. "The river moves very fast." She nodded again. Perhaps she was nodding that he had her words correctly. Perhaps she was nodding that, yes, the river moved very fast. "Widow," Chanticleer said, "are your children all right?" She shook her head. "Are they in danger?" She nodded, looking at him. "The river moves very fast," she whispered. Her voice made of the words a plain statement, but her eyes said, "Why should the river move so fast?" "Then they need help?" Chanticleer asked. "They are on branches," she whispered so softly that he barely heard her, but she was looking at him as clearly as before. "We came down river on branches. I tied them to branches." "How did you get off, widow? How did you come here? Can you swim? I need to know these things." Chanticleer felt that he had to hurry up. He had to get as many answers as possible before her voice died away altogether. "I couldn't untie them. God help me," she whispered, looking at him. "My husband is dead. He was killed under the terebinth oak." "That is surely something to be sad about," Chanticleer said, "and I too will be sad over the death of your husband. But forgive me, widow, not now. Your children are still alive. Tell me, where are the branches? What part of the river?" "He wouldn't leave them alone. He wouldn't run. He fought them, and they killed him under the terebinth oak." "Widow, are the branches near the level bank?" She gave him nothing, neither a nod nor a no. "Did the branches stop at the island?" Nothing. Chanticleer blinked against his impatience. "There is a cove on the river. Did you pass a cove? Did your branches go into a cove? It's like a bite out of the side of the river." Something picked at her memory. Her eyes came to focus. The branches were caught by reaching arms," she whispered. "Arms? Arms? Whose arms?" "Crooked, broken, cracking arms from above." Impulsively, Chanticleer stood up and walked, thinking. Of all the places along the river, the cove was the likeliest. The water ran too fast to the level bank. The island showed a vicious point against the current. Anywhere else the branches would have been shaken apart, but a whirlpool turned in that cove, drawing flotsam into it. It was a dangerous harbor. There were, of course, arms! Chanticleer cried. "Oh, widow, why did you think there were arms? Those are the tree limbs that overhang the cove. But look, there's a whirlpool in that place." "I wanted to feed them. They wanted to eat," whispered the wee widow mouse. "There was no milk." Chanticleer spoke lowly but urgently. "One more question. Do the branches touch the shore?" The mouse moved her mouth. Immediately, Chanticleer put his ear close to her mouth, but there wasn't a sound. And when he drew back to see her again, she was looking at him with clear, earnest, pleading eyes. Her eyes said, "Answer me." "Dear widow," he said, "I want to love your children. I want to see them living that I may love them. Can someone step from the shore to these branches, or does someone have to swim?" Again, her mouth moved without a sound. Her voice had finally gone away, but her lips were still making the words. Chanticleer could see what they said. They were not answering his question. They said, "Why should the river move so fast?" The hens had been making the best of a rainy day. They scratched, fed, cleaned the coop, and gossiped, all inside the coop. The scratching was useless unless it was for the exercise, because a wooden floor and a little scattering of straw yielded neither grubs nor seeds. The cracked corn on which they fed was not a joy, for it was too moist for their taste. Cleaning was a plain business, yet this is all that the weather had left for them to do. This and gossip, but that gossip more than made up for a gray and thankless day. They described Ebenezer Rat and his 2 careening wings 1,000 times over, clucking, chuckling, and laughing outright, until it seemed as if the sun were shining in this coop. They shook their 30 heads over the wounds which their lord had sustained in the fight. Chanticleer knew very well of the one wound in his stomach, but he had taken no notice of the fact that his neck, front, and back had been stripped of its feathers. This the hens had seen immediately. They could also see where Chanticleer had found 2 feathers long and strong enough to be planted in the rat's shoulders. They were primary feathers, one from each of his wings. Without them, the rooster's flight would be a grievous desperation. There was much to talk about, much to cluck and mutter over, much grist for a good gossip on a rainy day. Mundo Canny Dog just lay before the door all the morning long, with his 2 paws on top of his nose. He was trying to cover it up, but that was impossible. A spying weasel might cheerfully have thought that the dog was dead, except that once in a while he would sigh so powerfully that he blew up a cloud of dust from in front of his nostrils, and the dust made the hens to cackle and bitch. Suddenly the dog raised his head. Nobody had heard anything, but he had heard something. His hearing was remarkable. But a moment passed, and he put his head back down again with a sigh. With a thump, too, which caused 30 hens to hop. Then he heard it again. "Mundo Canny Dog! Get out here! I need you!" That was clear enough, even if it was still far away. Chanticleer had a crowing voice. "Barrel! You too! I want you both!" The gossiping stopped, and all the hens went still. The dog ambled out, and the chicken fluttered behind. "Oh, doctor!" the dog murmured when he saw Chanticleer squadging through the mud at a distance. "Such a stinking world that we live in, to do such a thing to you. I am maybe ill luck, and maybe should go away." For even at that distance, the rooster looked like a boiled soup bone. His chest, his stomach, his wing pits, and the loins between his legs were covered with a foul crust of gray mud, which had dried, hardened, and cracked. It was an odd casing to be walking in, but he was walking in it. But who can walk with a spade between his legs? He waddled. He rocked left and right. His neck was a skinny, pink, and featherless thing. It was a bent finger coming out of his shoulders, a sadness to see on one so royal. And on his back was what? A mud lump? A dead fish? Why, if the rooster would only stand up straight, it would fall off and he would be rid of it. but he waddled crouched over as if he wanted the morsel to stay on his back, and that, of course, made waddling an even greater difficulty. "Dog, you are a wizard," the rooster crowed. Never mind the way he looked, Chanticleer crowed like healthy thunder. "And chicken, you surely know what you're doing. Don't let anybody tell you that your brains are maple wood. When somebody says that he needs you," crowed Chanticleer as he puffed along, "you know he doesn't mean it. Prophets, providential geniuses, you know he only wants you to gape at him until he dies." "Oh, no, Doctor," said the dog, whose nose was a log. "That's not what you meant. Forgive my speaking up, but it seemed to me that you needed us." "Well, then, shag it, you suitcase! Get over here!" Mundocani could run very fast when he had to, and Beryl came flipping behind. "That's good to see," said Chanticleer when they were near. "I need your speed, mutt. Beryl," he said, "hold still and be tender." The rooster laid the mouse, who had been borne upon his back, on Beryl's clean back. The wee widow mouse was asleep, and so she was no help to the one who carried her. "You will take this one back to the coop. Warm her, feed her, bring her back to life, and for the Lord's sake be quiet around her while she sleeps. Beryl," he said, "walk tenderly." "I will, my lord," said the hen. Chanticleer watched her narrowly to see whether her walk was indeed a tender one, and it was. "Dog, squat down," he commanded, and Mundocani went down in the mud. Chanticleer climbed onto his back and grabbed the mangy fur in either claw. "Do you know where the river is?" "In my childhood," sighed the dog, "I played at the edge of the water. My reflection I saw once when I was old enough to know evil. My nose—" "You know where the river is. Run, dog! Skin the wind! Run to the cove which is west of Liverbrook! Move!" And a dog did skin the wind. Mundocani had a talent which nobody would have suspected. He could run like any horse at a full gallop. He spun clots of mud out from under his paws with every wide, wild stride. The muscles in his hips and withers rolled, snapped, and tightened with perfect power, and the wind in Chanticleer's face blinded him. The rooster was hard-pressed to hang on, but he did. He stuck out his wings for the balance, leaned forward, crowed for pure joy at the speed underneath him, and gripped the sparse fur with all of his strength. Mundocani had a talent indeed. The miles were minutes. The green hills a gone-again blur, the trees a constant danger avoided, the rain tiny bullets in Chanticleer's face. They sped up a long rise and fairly flew over the top of it. There Chanticleer saw a valley, and in the bottom of it the gray river. So many miles, so quickly. Now down the side of the valley, with barely a paw on the ground. The river had looked flat and still from above, a gray weight at the bottom of the valley, but as they plunged down to it, Chanticleer saw violence in the water. The current whirled and eddied near the shore. At the center of the river, that current went flat out in one direction, westward toward the sea with tremendous might. The rains had swollen the river, but how, thought Chanticleer, could loose branches and mice survive on the face of that water? And why, for the Lord's sake, would they want to take such a trip? A cluster of trees showed where the cove was to their right. Between them and the trees pumped the dark brown Liverbrook, thick with water. Mundocani never paused, but took the brook all in a single leap, touched land on the other side, and galloped. He ran with the river. Chanticleer was surprised to find that so much water and so great a current, choked with so many logs, branches, and shunt, made not a sound at all. Then Mundocani sailed into the cluster of trees. Not the dog, but the rooster, was breathing hard as they stared at the jam of wood spinning in the cove. Tree limbs from above were holding the flimsy island in place, but they wouldn't much longer, because the tree limbs and the island were untwisting one from the other, and then there would be no hope for it at all. "She said that she tied them to the branches," Chanticleer panted. "Can you see them? Can you see them? What do you see?" "What are they?" Chanticleer had forgotten to give the dog any reason for their trip. "Her children! The mouse's children!" "Oh, master of the universe!" Mondocani began to weep on the spot. "Not now!" the rooster barked. "Look for them! What do you see?" It was like trying to spy a friend on a merry-go-round. This mass of wood had many hidden parts to it, all of it going in circles. The more Chanticleer stared, the more he didn't see what was really there. Wood was there, branches, as the mouse had said, twigs, stems, limbs, leaves, branches, broken and whole, naked and barked, rotten and dry and white above the water. But the rooster began to see other things. Bones, shattered ribs, choppy dry fingers clutching at the air, pieces of crushed skull, a spinning cemetery of bones, and for just a moment it made him afraid. "There!" shouted the dog. His vision was remarkable. "What's that?" Chanticleer saw the branches again. "Where?" "There!" His nose turned circles, pointing. "Mondocani, dog! There they are!" It was a bird's nest, crammed tightly into a dense part of the branches, a mere fist of twigs. The nest was not tied to the branches, but the children were tied into the nest. Many strands of hair had been patiently tied, criss-cross over the top of the nest, and Chanticleer could see bulges in the webbing, bodies bumping it. He leaped to a low branch on the tree beside him, found his balance, and then leaped to a higher branch. This way he climbed the tree to a place where it leaned out over the water. Now he could walk along a limb, flipping his feathers to keep balance. The limbs sank underneath his weight. His wings went out, but he didn't fall. By his beak and his claws he grappled his way down droopy branches until he hung, head down, directly over the turning island. Out of the corner of his eye he saw a part of the shore which he had not seen before. There was something white there, like a stone or a pillow or salt, but in the middle of it was a burning patch of brilliant color. There was no time for the looking. He dropped down. With the edge of his beak, Chanticleer ripped the hair from the nest. 7 tiny mice squeezed down into the farthest corner, terrified. He stuck his wing into the nest. That didn't help matters any. Chanticleer struggled with his own impatience at tiny bits of stupidity. Simply, they did not know that they should climb this monstrous wedge to safety, and they would have to be told. "Listen to me, children," Chanticleer said. "Your mother is beautiful. She has a coat as warm as sleep. She has a dry place in which to sing to you. But do please listen to me. She isn't here, and the dry place isn't here." Perhaps not his words themselves, perhaps his tone and the steady look in his eyes spoke to them, for they looked back at the rooster, somewhat sadder but less afraid. "So she sent me to you with this message. Come closer to hear it." One did wriggle closer. Chanticleer's heart beat violently. "She said, 'A rooster will give his wing to you. This wing, and I'm the rooster. Forgive me, I have a bad voice.' And she said, 'You, my children, must hurry to climb onto his wing. Do please, children, hurry, climb onto my wing.'" To Chanticleer it seemed as if the river and the whole world were turning circles, while the thicket island stood still. Once again, in the flash of passing, he saw white upon the shore. But then he shifted his weight. The island dipped, and not a mouse was climbing. Listen to me." The mice were watching him. It broke his heart how much their gaze resembled their mother's. "Listen. The most important part of her message is something only the smartest of you can understand. The others are too foolish to understand it, but one of you is much smarter than the rest. She said, 'I am waiting for you.' Now what do you suppose this means?" Immediately one mouse, his pink skin so thin that his bones could be seen within, climbed onto the wing by impossibly small claws. 2 more followed. "There's the smart one!" Chanticleer hooted, restrained. "Oh, God bless the smart one! And there's a brave one, too, braver than all the rest. God willing, he will know that you have to climb all the way to my back. Dangerous, dangerous climb, and he will know you have to burrow beneath my feathers." So the brave one squirmed past the smart one, and a procession of naked children needled the rooster's shoulders, while he held himself almighty rigid. Dizzy, swallowing crow after urgent crow until he choked, counting the children before his hot eye, he held still until the last mouse was snuggled in place. Then he exploded. Across the nodding island, up with a wild leap, barely grabbing a branch in his claw. The island bowed and floated away. Chanticleer's tree sank beneath his weight. The rooster's tail touched water and was tugged by it. He said a curse word. When his other claw would not go high enough to find a grip because of the crusty mud between his legs, he said a dozen more curse words and damned the river pulling at him. There was no island now. He hung all alone like bait in the middle of the cove, heavy with mud from his neck to his tail. It was at that particular moment that his eye caught the white object on the shore. Perhaps in the desperation his senses were sharper because he recognized it. Not salt. It was a hen, but no hen he had ever seen before, and the color on her was vermilion, blazing at her throat. All at once Chanticleer found some more energy inside of him for getting his other claw to the branch. It was wonderful how quickly that claw took hold, and how powerfully claw followed claw up the droopy branch. Into the tree he went like a whiz, across the limb, and down the trunk like a born squirrel. "Mundocani, open your mouth!" he roared. Mundocani opened his mouth. He wanted to put a word into it, or perhaps a whole sentence, but before he could do that, Chanticleer stuck his head in and pecked at the tongue until it went backward into the throat. "Gh!" Mundocani's dog said. And Chanticleer said, I understand totally. Good friend, keep your tongue where it is. I've some passengers for you." And hastily, but with marvelous care, he picked the mice out of his back feathers, one at a time, and set them down in Mundocani's mouth. "Not a very dry place," he said to them, "and it's a certain fact that the clog in the back isn't your mother, but it's the way to your mother, children, your coach, and your mother will rejoice to see you again. Dog, shut it," he said. The dog did, and his eyes began to water. "If you sneeze, Leatherhead," the rooster roared, "I'll plug your nose, and then it will blow up like a balloon." Mundocani shook his head. That wasn't why his eyes were watering. Now Chanticleer scrambled down the oily shore to the place where he had seen the hen. She was lying unconscious on her back, her small claws balled on top of her. At her throat her feathers were crimson and beautiful, but her tail feathers were lapped in water, and she was wet to the roots. Her beak was open, but she was not dead, and she was so beautiful. Now Chanticleer the Ready did a most unready thing. He sat down and stared. Perhaps if he had first seen her while she walked among a flock of hens, clucking and pouting, this might not have happened to him. But he saw her in her weakness. He saw her lying open, where anyone in the world could have come by and hurt her. He saw her loose, sleeping, and without protection whatsoever. He saw her truthful when she was not pretending to be anything else than a purely white hen with fire at her throat. He saw her when she didn't see him back. He saw her lovely. Chanticleer stood up. Then he sat down again. Again he stood up. He ran to find Mundocani, but the dog had gone. So the rooster returned and sat down, close enough to touch her, should he work up the nerve. Well, the fact is, Chanticleer the rooster wanted to wake her up, but he didn't know how. He was embarrassed. Her sleep embarrassed him. He tried a hoarse little crow, a cough, really, but the hen remained still. If she didn't notice the rain which fell everywhere upon her stomach and wings, how could she notice the clearing of one's throat? So Chanticleer apologized aloud several times, and then he crowed. He crowed a round, loud morning crow, lauds, with the full flapping of his wings and the thrusting of his head. Then he watched her and saw her eyes roll underneath their lids, but that was all. He was in anguish. "I can't carry you," he pleaded. "I can barely walk. You have to wake up." And then he reached out and touched her. He snapped back, afraid to be caught in the act, but it did no good. After a long debate with himself, he took courage and shook her. Her head lolled back and forth. He shook her again, and this time she took a sharp breath and began to cough. "Glory, glory, glory," Chanticleer mumbled, but he got away from her and watched. The hen rolled over onto her stomach with the coughing and slowly stood up. She had to push at the ground in order to stand because she was so weak, but she tottered and stood. Chanticleer unconsciously patted his wings together. Her eyes took on a light. Around at the river she looked, around at the weather, as if she didn't understand either one. Then she looked, suddenly, at Chanticleer himself, and the hen screamed. It was a scream of white terror. Chanticleer's stomach turned immediately to water, and his legs trembled. "Don't," he said, still patting his poor wings together and hopping from leg to leg. But the hen only screamed the more, crazy, unaccountable screaming. Her mouth wide open, she turned and tried to run away. But it was a sadly broken run, with her wings slapping at the ground. She kept slipping toward the river. Chanticleer couldn't go after her. He felt too guilty, but he couldn't stand still and watch her pain and do nothing, especially because he did feel guilty. So he said, "Oh, please don't," and hoped with all his heart that she would stop of her own accord. She didn't. She came treacherously close to the current. Her screaming took on syllables and resolved into a single word, repeated again and again, without meaning and without end. "Cockatrice!" She was screaming, so full of terror. "Cockatrice! Cockatrice! Cockatrice!" Chanticleer could stand it no more. Every instinct in him was appalled to see her so careless of her life. In spite of himself, he began to run after her. Nor was his run any better than hers. He too stumbled on account of his mud cast, but he ran with a purpose. He caught up with the hen. With his beak he grabbed the back of her neck, and he wrapped his wings around her. She fought him wildly, flailing her wings and beating him on the sides of his head, but he didn't fight back. He just held her as tightly as he could, and together they began to slip into the river. She turned her head. With a ghastly determination, the hen tried to pierce the rooster's eyes with her beak. But Chanticleer put down his head, letting her cut into his neck, and he started to cry. Not for any pain he cried, but because he was exhausted, and because the weather had been so damnably careless, and because she was hitting him at all. He held her tightly, and he cried. And then, as they churned in the water, Chanticleer's cast of mud began to melt and to break up. Chunks of it floated off or sank, and his wound opened again and began to bleed. His blood colored the water. It was the blood which made the hen gutter in her throat and finally stop her screaming. For in a moment she was staring at her own feathers where it stained her. And then she searched the rooster before her and gazed at his chest and stomach, where there was no longer the gray mud, but golden feathers in a bleeding wound. She closed her mouth and looked stricken in her soul. "You're hurt," she said strangely. "You can be hurt. Oh, look how badly you are hurt." Chanticleer was able to pull her to shore, still holding her tight, tighter than ever, and the two of them lay down in the rain for a while. Both of them were trembling violently. Both of them were crying.